Hi everyone, welcome to Psychic Creations. This show is what I term a listening program, as it is a fun narration rather than a lot of photos or a video. Please enjoy. Welcome to my 2021 Halloween program, number 1. Halloween conjures up all kinds of ghoulish visions and facts. But for my first Halloween program of this season, I'm taking the ghoulish visions and facts one step further. This show is titled Facts About the Deceased, and I will be narrating on items of interesting departures and fears that certain cultures adhere to. Did you know that clothing has been the cause of numerous deaths? Yes. When corsets were very popular, sometimes they were laced so tight they could cut a woman's stomach in half. Super popular during the Victorian era. It was thought that the tighter you could lace your corset, the better. Unfortunately, the practice often resulted in women doing permanent, gruesome damage to their bodies. In one reported case, a woman with a 13-inch waist died, and it was found that her liver had been punctured by 3 ribs. Another woman's corset punctured wounds in her heart, and still another had her liver flattened by tight lacing. Crinolines could cause many women to constantly fall over and occasionally set themselves on fire. Extreme caution and care was suggested while wearing a crinoline. Crinolines, or what is known as hoop skirts, were in vogue for much of the 19th century. They were often made out of a combination of horsehair and steel. Because the hoop of the skirt sat out so far from the body, women had to be incredibly careful about how they walked about in their dresses. Many women caught fire while wearing their crinoline skirt. Additionally, if the skirt was caught by the wind, a woman could find herself potentially ushered off the edge of a pier or a cliff. And what's more, hoop and straight skirts were often caught in wheels of wagons and also in machinery, like the next story tells. On February 18, 1873, a terrible accident occurred at the Gould and Curry hoisting work, resulting in the almost instant death of Mrs. Amelia McKay. Amelia had been married but just a few months and was only 16 years old. She had been in the habit of visiting the works at night and remaining with her husband until the end of his shift at 8 o'clock in the morning. One night she was in the engine room, again waiting until it was time for him to go home, and she had been seated near the engine. She got up and passed around a very large pumping machine, which was placed in the center of the room. Her husband, remaining near the engine, suddenly heard Amelia shriek and, turning about, saw her going down backwards into the space between the large spur wheel and the stone foundation upon which the machinery sits. He just caught sight of her feet thrown up into the air as she went down. He at once shut off the steam, which stopped the engine by the time the piston wheel had made 1 revolution and the large spur wheel had turned about 1/4 round. McKay at once rushed to his wife's assistance as she was drawn in between the cogs. Amelia was tightly wedged in between the huge spur wheel and the floor. So tightly she was wedged in that 2 men were unable to extricate her. She was completely crushed from above the hips down to the knees. The poor woman lived only 4 minutes. Dr. Hopkins, who had been sent for, arrived soon after and assisted in extricating the body, which after death proved a difficult task. The body was wedged down in the bottom of the pit of stonework surrounding the wheel, in a space between the wheel and the wall that was only a few inches in width. What happened was, after going around the machinery, upon leaving her husband, she went to the desk and got a book, and then she started to return. Well, instead of returning by the way she went, she undertook to go straight back through the machinery by stepping upon the stone foundation wall and walking along the narrow pathway of the division wall between the spur wheel and the pinion on the side of the huge flywheel and crank on the other. In making her way across, she gathered her dress about her and held it up until she passed the spur wheel, then dropped it without thinking of the wheel. When the dress was caught and she was drawn down between the corners of the teeth of the two wheels, and after her right hip had been mangled, she was carried down under the large wheel and further crushed and mutilated before the machinery ceased to move. Fatalities happened many times to miners in our northern Nevada mines, but those deaths weren't limited to men. On December 1st, 1869, a terrible accident occurred at the Sunderland Mill in Lower Gold Hill, whereby a lady resident of this town was so badly injured that death was the result. And another, on the lower floor of the mine stands a barrel into which flows a small stream of hot condensed water from the stream through a pipe. Through a side door nearby, the neighbors have always been allowed free access and permission to supply themselves with this water for washing and other purposes. A few feet from the barrel, and about 1.5 feet from the floor, the end of the counter shaft, which runs the pans on the floor above, projects about 10 inches beyond a pulley, and a slot is cut along the one side of it for the key which fastens this pulley onto the shaft. Edward Burke, who kept a boarding house on Main Street just below the mill, came in for water, followed directly afterwards by Mrs. Bridget Curran, who also lives by in a little cottage. She stood just behind him waiting as he dipped water from the barrel, when suddenly, above the loud din of the batteries and the machinery, he heard her cry out, and immediately turning, saw the unfortunate woman caught by her steel hoop skirt as it was wound tightly around the projecting end of the shaft, and being carried around with each revolution, her head beating upon the floor. Burke made a desperate attempt to tear her skirts loose, but he could not. He then succeeded in attracting the attention of Mr. Gray, the superintendent of the mill, who was upon the floor above and who immediately sprang to the rescue. Mr. Gray ran to the engine room and soon stopped the mill. Even then, they could only get the skirts free from the shaft by cutting them off with a hatchet. The poor woman was insensible and remained in that condition to the time of her death, which was about 2 hours. But on the other side of the clothing coin, there was a woman in Virginia City in 1898 where her clothing saved her life, as when S.C. Douglas shot Miss Gussie Melville, who was the proprietress of the Demi-Monde Resort. Mr. Douglas was having trouble with Gussie, left the place, and shortly returned. When Gussie opened the door, Douglas fired, and one bullet struck the woman's corset near her heart. The corset was shattered, but the bullet made only a superficial wound, her corset acting as a coat of mail. Douglas was arrested, and Miss Melville recovered quite nicely. Through the ages, there have been many unusual deaths. In 620 BC, Draco, the Athenian lawmaker, was reportedly smothered to death by gifts of cloaks and hats that were showered upon him by appreciative citizens at the theater on Aegina. On August 22, 1888, at around 8:30 p.m., a shower of meteorites fell like rain on a village in then part of the Ottoman Empire. One man died, and his death is considered the only credible case of death by meteorite. The Victorians found many unusual ways to meet their demise, like the young lady from Liverpool who died after eating too much of her own hair. The postmortem showed a 2-pound hairball inside her that had ulcerated her stomach. And then, in 1958, Gareth Jones, an actor, died of a heart attack between scenes of a live television play, Underground, on the ITV network in the United Kingdom. Coincidentally, his character was supposed to die of a heart attack in a later scene in the play. In 1988, a poodle named Catchy in Buenos Aires fell from 13 floors and fatally hit a 75-year-old woman, killing them both instantly. In the course of the events, 46-year-old Edith Sola, who came to see the incident, was fatally hit by a bus. An unidentified man who witnessed her death had a heart attack and also died on the way to the hospital. In 2017, Robert Dreyer, 89 years old, crashed his car into a fire hydrant and then was swallowed by a sinkhole created by the broken water line which had fed the hydrant. December 7th of 2019, Michael Kasonovich, 21, was crushed by a 2002 Lexus in South Jamaica, Queens, New York City, after its owner started it by remote control. It rolled forward, and he was pinned between the two vehicles. Bystanders tried to push them apart, but as they did, the car rolled forward and crushed him again. He died of his injuries later that evening. Paris green was one of the most fashionable colors of the 19th century. It was a vivid blue-green that was used in many household paints, wallpapers, and fabrics. It was also highly toxic as it was made with arsenic. Widely available in hardware stores, it was also used as an insecticide in rat poison. Paris green also provided the means for a young Brooklyn girl to take her life in 1882. The New York Times told this tale under the headline, "A Strange Suicide." Louisa Cruikshank, aged just 18 and living surrounded with every luxury in her family home, frequently expressed a wish to die, according to her mother's later testimony. One February morning, while walking with her sister to the Brooklyn Public Library, Louisa slipped into a hardware shop and bought some of the popular paint. The next day, Louisa was playing a waltz on the piano when she fell suddenly ill. Her last words were chillingly calm. "Mama, I may as well tell you, I have taken Paris green. I have done what I said I would do." When 57-year-old Harriet Dillon passed away, her cause of death was recorded as exhaustion and mental alienation. During the Victorian era, mental anguish, melancholia, and exhaustion were terms sometimes used to describe what we might now call mental illness. Doctors who specialized in the study of mental pathology were often called alienists, studying those who were deemed alien by society. Thomas Bradford was a spiritualist who committed suicide to prove the afterlife was real. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, spiritualism offered a new comfort to those in mourning. The dearly departed were never far away, proponents claimed, and certain attuned individuals could channel them back into our realm for grieving families. Thomas Bradford put an ad in the paper looking for someone interested in spiritualistic science. A woman named Ruth Durand responded. I answered his advertisement through a simple desire to know more about a thing in which I was little versed, she told reporters later. I am not a spiritualist, nor a believer in the psychic. When the two met, Bradford explained that he believed there was only one way to prove the existence of an afterlife. Two minds properly attuned, one of which must shed its earthly mantle. Bradford intended to shed his fleshy confinements and contact Durand from the afterlife. On February 6, 1921, Bradford blew out the pilot light of the heater in his room he was renting, turned on the gas, and lay in bed breathing the fumes until he was dead. When police arrived, they found a note in Bradford's typewriter which read, "And it is through scientific fact that I propose to demonstrate clearly the phenomena of spirits and prove that all the phenomena is outside the domain of supernatural." Durand said, I am his friend. If he can cause his spirit to come back to earth, I believe his spirit will come to me first. After 2 days, the New York Times ran a story titled, Dead Spiritualists Silent, in which it was reported that Durand had yet to receive any transmissions from the afterlife. 3 days later, while Durand was holding a 2-week-long vigil in her parlor, awaiting contact, a woman named Lulu Mack claimed to hear the spirit of Bradford calling her. According to Mack, she didn't know who Bradford was, had not heard his story, but she discovered he was trying to communicate with her when she visited the Reverend Medium. During the seance, Mack heard a voice calling, Thomas Bradford! Thomas Bradford! Life has fled the body of Thomas Lynn Bradford, but his spirit is hovering near and calling us to hear its message, Mack told reporters. I have heard the call of his spirit. It is calling to me even now. But I cannot hear the message it would send because the spirit is too weak. Bradford's spirit was weak, Mack said, because he had taken his own life. It may take some time for him to be purged and purified and pass into the next sphere. He may be strong enough to communicate once he reaches the 2nd or 3rd altitude, Mack explained. 1 week after Bradford's birth into spirit life, on February 12th, Durand said she felt a strange presence, which she believed to be Bradford. She had the vague notion that he would contact her that evening, but he was not strong enough to manifest on his own. Psychic students throughout the city agreed to concentrate at 9 that evening on the professor to, quote, accelerate the return of his spirit, papers reported. Leading spiritualistic pastors urged their congregations to join the, quote, concentration party. At 9 p.m., the hour appointed by Durand's premonition, she and 3 witnesses who reportedly did not believe in spiritualism gathered in her dimly lit parlor that evening. When she felt the sensation of Bradford's presence, Durand put her hands to her temples. Turn out the light, she instructed. The lamp winked out. I hear his voice, Durand said. It is faint, but it grows more distinct. Is it the professor? Then she said, write this. In short bursts, Durand dictated a message from Bradford. I am the professor who speaks to you from the beyond. I have broken through the veil. The help of the living has greatly assisted me. I simply went to sleep. I woke up and at first did not realize that I had passed on. I find no great change apparent. I expected things to be much different. They are not. Human forms are retained in outline, but not in the physical. I have not traveled far. I am still much in the darkness. I see many people. They appear natural. There is a lightness of responsibility here unlike in life. One feels full of rapture and happiness. Persons of like natures associate. I am associated with other investigators. I do not repent my act. My present plane is but the first series. I am still investigating the future planes regarding which we in this plane are as ignorant as are earthly beings of the life just beyond human life. Then Bradford's voice grew weak, the light flickered back on, and he was gone. Are you certain beyond doubt that you heard from Bradford? One of the witnesses asked Duran. I am convinced, Duran replied. I never heard a spirit voice before. That was the professor, without a doubt. When Elizabeth I died in the very early hours of the 24th of March, 1603, the sun finally set on the age of Gloriana. Indeed, a monumental era in England's history was at an end. Even her contemporaries speak of how strange the common folk of the realm found the name of king when James VI of Scotland was proclaimed as her successor just hours after her demise. There was to be no dynastic struggle, no bloodshed, just immense shock, sorrow, and grieving for the only monarch many living in London at the time had ever known, for her reign of 44 years and 4 months was, at the time, a far greater part of a man's age. Elizabeth's decline into ill health began January of that year, 3 months before her death. The Queen, who had always enjoyed health without impairment, which, interestingly, attributes to her abstinence from wine and a temperate diet, became aware of weakness and indisposition in her health. On an icy and rainy January day, the Queen left Westminster for the last time. She traveled to Richmond to refresh herself. However, it was to be of no avail. This was indeed the beginning of the end for the 69-year-old Queen. Her descent into despair and physical decay were unavoidable from that point forward. As time went on, she spent increasing amounts of time in prayer and would only speak with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, who encouraged her to turn her mind to God. During this period, Elizabeth asked that her inauguration ring, which symbolized her marriage to England, and which she had worn since the day of her coronation, be filed off her finger, as it was so grown into the flesh. The Tudors, a superstitious lot, saw this as a bad omen. With the physical removal of the ring, Elizabeth's contractual obligation to the country was ended, and that the marriage would be dissolved. This being interpreted as heralding her imminent death, Elizabeth was letting go of an extraordinary life. By March, the Queen fell into a heavy dullness, which she would not speak. Her throat was dry and sore as almonds glands swelled. She gave herself over to her meditations, allowing the Archbishop to pray for her. As death approached, her Lord Keeper and secretary begged the dying queen to name her successor, which she did in a gasping breath. It was to be James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth died in her privy chambers at Richmond Palace. She made it very clear that she did not wish to be disemboweled following death, as would be customary. Yet shortly after the Queen died, Robar Cecil, Elizabeth's secretary, left orders with the surgeons to do so, while he went to London to proclaim James VI the new King of England. And so the Queen was embalmed and her body transferred to a lead-lined wooden coffin. Elizabeth's body lay in state at Richmond for several days before being transferred to a barge and brought downstream to the Palace of Whitehall. The coffin was draped in velvet and watched every night by, quote, 6 several ladies. During this period, reports stated that a loud crack came from the coffin as Elizabeth's body and head broke open from the pressures of gases released as the corpse decayed. While the force of the explosion splintered the wood, lead, and cerecloth, people speculated on how much worse might it have been if the body had not been opened and disemboweled after death. There is a very strange vision when you look up at a mountain in southwest China, as there are wooden coffins suspended on a cliff, only supported by 2 or 3 rough-hewn logs, poles, that are chiseled into the cliffside. These are the last remnants of the Bo people that were exterminated by the Ming Dynasty around 400 years ago. Historians remain baffled as to why this ancient tribe felt that this was the best way to honor the dead, but the 160 wooden caskets remaining, some coffins have fallen over the years, nailed up high to the cliffside, mark the only reminder left by the Bo people. Famadihana, also known as turning the bones, is still practiced by the Malagasy people of Madagascar. Every 7 years or so, the community opened their family crypts and exhumed their ancestors' bodies to hasten decomposition. In this culture, decomposition is seen as a crucial step in entering the afterlife. When the body is exhumed, the people wrap it in cloth and dance with it to live music. Special food and beverages are distributed to various guests and members of the family. The festival is seen as a way of celebrating their loved ones and demonstrating the importance of kinship even after death. How about a drive-through funeral? Modern-day funeral practices can be found in Los Angeles, California. Evidently, people have better things to do than sit in a church, and time can be saved by paying your last respects from the driver's seat of your car. These funerals often take place behind a bulletproof glass and become popular with gang members after cemetery shootouts in the 1980s made them reluctant to gather for funerals. This concludes the first Halloween show titled Death's Departures, and next week, Halloween show number 2 features Death's Happenings.